Hello, alumni and friends. Welcome to the 2021 Digital Alumni Festival and to The Power of Giving Away Power, presented by Cambridge in America and the Churchill Archive Center. We hope you are safe and well. We are glad you are joining us today. A few housekeeping notes before we welcome our speakers. Your microphone and camera will be turned off throughout. This session will have a Q&A following the presentation. You are welcome to submit Q&A questions throughout the talk using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Of course, our speakers will attempt to address as many questions as possible, but time is limited. We thank you in advance for your understanding if your question is not answered. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded onto both the Cambridge in America and the Dear World, Yours Cambridge YouTube channels. We have over 200 alumni and friends registered today, tuning in from around the world. Welcome again to those just joining us for a discussion of the new book, The Power of Giving Away Power, between the author, former U.S. Ambassador Matthew Barzun, and Alan Packwood. Today's moderator, Alan Packwood, is a fellow of Churchill College, the director of the Churchill Archive Center, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He was awarded an OBE for services to archives and scholarship in the 2016 Queen's Birthday Honors. Alan is a qualified archivist and has worked at the Churchill Archive Center since September 1995, succeeding Dr. Piers Brendan as acting keeper in 2001, before being appointed director in 2002. Alan was co-curator of Churchill and the Great Republic, a Library of Congress exhibition which ran from February through July 2004, and of Churchill, The Power of Words, a display at the Morgan Library in New York from June till September of 2012. Please welcome to your screen, Alan Packwood.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on whereabouts you're watching from. And thank you, Elizabeth, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to all of your colleagues at Cambridge in America for making this discussion and indeed this festival possible in such challenging times. The Churchill Archive Centre, located in Churchill College, Cambridge, is a repository for the papers of a huge number of leaders, innovators and influencers. Prime ministers like Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher and John Major, scientists like Frank Whittle, Rosalind Franklin and John Cockcroft, military commanders like Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay and Field Marshal Lord Slim, and pioneering sociologists like Michael Young, to name but a few. But a quick look at any of these collections will confirm one thing, namely that very rarely, if ever, did any of these individuals achieve anything on their own. They worked within teams and networks, sometimes fixed, often changing. Churchill may have said that the only thing worse than fighting with allies was fighting without them, but he was actually dependent on a huge range of allies. Allies on the international scene, allies within his war cabinet, allies within Parliament, allies within his personal secretariat, and drawn from the ranks of his friends, advisors, and family. And this is something that we may well come back to in our discussion in a moment. But my point is this, that even he, Winston Churchill, the sort of icon and exemplar of strong leadership, was far more collaborative and more consultative and more dependent on others than is often portrayed. And if anything, the wealth of material assembled under one roof here in the Churchill Archive Centre is an illustration of interdependence. And interdependence, of course, is one of the themes of Matthew Barzun's excellent book, The Power of Giving Away Power, which we're discussing today. I first had the pleasure of meeting Matthew a few years ago when, as United States Ambassador to the UK, he visited Churchill College and he was shown some of our documents. But it was clear then that he was not interested in stereotypes of leadership, but rather in how to affect change. He wanted to talk to students and to school children, and that conversation was definitely a two-way one, not a lecture or a seminar, but a dialogue. Matthew has been a successful businessman, helping to set up the C networks in the early 1990s. He's been a political campaigner involved in pioneering new methods of electioneering, and he's been a diplomat, representing his country as ambassador in Stockholm and in London. It is an amazing personal journey, and one that has clearly led him to think deeply about the working of different teams and what makes them successful. It's a path that's led him away from traditional models or expectations of political and business leadership towards a more inclusive, flexible, integrated, and interdependent approach. An approach that sees people truly coming together to create something that is more than the sum of their parts. And his book traces the history of this alternative style of working and then develops it by applying it to his own experience. So, Matthew, welcome. Let's start with a quote. And it's a quote which you refer to in the book. The words are very famous. They will be recognized by many people on this call, and thereby, of course, Teddy Roosevelt. And the quote is this: "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short and short again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms and great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." Sort of great words, almost Churchillian in a way. But what is your reaction to that quote?
Thank you, Alan. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth. Great to be with you all. Yeah, that is, and it's a tricky one to start with, Alan, because, and you read it so beautifully. When I was 11 years old, my parents got divorced, and I had a really cool, still do, a great Uncle John, and he sensed that I was struggling, and he came up to Boston, Massachusetts, where I was raised, and sort of whisked me away on a long road trip. And I was sitting in the back seat, and he made me memorize that at age 11. And so it's still up here, forever. And he would, every time we get together, as I grew older, he'd make me recite it. And he made me recite it on my wedding day. And I'll get back to that in a moment. Now, that is obviously beautiful words, very well. People love that. So I should say, John McCain loved it. President Obama read that or quoted from it at his beautiful eulogy for Senator John McCain in one of these rare bipartisan moments of the last decade. All the midshipmen at our Naval Academy are required to memorize it. Brene Brown, someone I admire greatly, that Daring Greatly is one of the titles of her books. It's inspired her whole work. Nelson Mandela, I mean, I could go on, and I'll close with LeBron James, had it etched into his basketball trainers, as you all would say. Okay, so I get why everybody loves it, right? It makes for high drama. But I think it is really missing something, and it inspires in me, Alan, actually frustration, because it presents to us a forced and false choice between two alternatives. And it's worth mentioning, I think Aristotle said, the soul never thinks without an image. The soul never thinks without an image. And there are a lot of images we have in our mind, whether we know them or not. So this in the arena, which is how this is known, that image gives us two choices. Look, you either go, it is a gladiatorial setup, go in, face marred with dust and sweat and blood. Fight it out, win or lose, and at least try. So there's the fight it out option, or sit it out and be a bystander. Sit on the sidelines and be it. So those are the two choices. And I get it. If confronted with those only two, then of course, going and fighting it out. But I think there's an important, especially now, and look around the world, wherever we might be joining from today, there's an alternative that isn't given enough attention, encouragement, that isn't fight it out and it isn't sit it out. And it is play it through, work it out, all these things. And you touched on this in your lovely introduction. All the things in life that do not lend themselves to winning and losing, namely, right? And so things like you're not going to win your career, you're not going to win parenting, you are not going to win a marriage. Although if you try to win your marriage, you might very well lose it, right? And so I remember, and I'll maybe end it here, that since leaving London and back at the end of Obama's administration, whenever I would be with any group of people, this is pre-COVID, so you'd actually see fellow human beings face to face. If you had 10 people together and you asked them, what's the opposite of winning? They'd all say losing, but that was just a warm up. Then you say, well, now what's the opposite of winning and losing? And 9 out of 10 of us say some version of this. I don't know, not playing. In other words, sitting it out. 1 in 10 of us says playing, or laughing, or learning, or living, or all the other things we do that don't lend themselves to winning or losing. But this mindset, which is reinforced by Teddy Roosevelt's beautiful words, fight it out or sit it out. If you are not engaged in combat of one sort or another, win or lose, you are doing nothing. And that to me is at the root of so much that we struggle with right now, and that we need to open up the idea of working through and playing through things together with other people sitting around a table, which is how most of the wonderful innovations you cataloged, that's how wars were won, and that's how scientific discoveries were made, and on and on.
Well, I love your quote by Aristotle, the soul never thinks without an image. And I think one of the really powerful things about your book is that it's full of very good, strong images to get people thinking about these issues. And of course, you really start off by talking about mindsets, and by summarizing those mindsets as images that appear on the American $1 bill.
Thank you for bringing that prop.
So you talk of a pyramid mindset, and you contrast it with the constellation mindset. And I think this goes to the heart of your arguments. I wondered if, for our listeners, you could explain what exactly you mean by pyramid and constellation.
Sure. Let's start with the pyramid. So the pyramid for me is the perfect symbol for hierarchical thinking. Now, the obvious forms of it, I think we're all pretty aware of. And certainly here we are in 2021. I mean, the sort of caricature of the boss barking down orders from the corner office is certainly out of fashion. It's not out of the workplace yet, but it's certainly not trendy. So lording power over others is sort of an obvious form of hierarchy, but it exists way more in almost every organization, big, small, nonprofit, government agency, corporate, you name it, it's there. And now I hope this is one of these Churchill quotes that's real. You will tell me, since you're the expert. But remember, didn't he say, we shape buildings, thereafter they shape us? Is that a real one?
Yes, I can confirm a genuine quote. He was talking about rebuilding the House of Commons after wartime damage.
Oh, that topic again. Yeah. Okay. So I think the same is true with organizations. And so this hierarchical mindset, and just as a little silly thing, if you go and try to build an org chart in Microsoft Office, you choose the various menus. And the default setting is org chart hierarchy. And that makes all those boxes, and it makes a big triangle pyramid out of it. That does something to us inside. We start asking, and this is really important in a hierarchy, we ask sort of unit economics of any hierarchy are, there's a head, there's a point, and there are divisions. And so what we end up getting really good at is asking who's in charge, what's the point, where do I fit in? Over and over and over again. And it makes sense because in a hierarchy, in a pyramid world, as I call it, those kind of questions, those are sort of like the power cables that link it from the top to the bottom and the bottom to the top. But what happens over time is that we get really good at knowing who's up and who's down. We get really good at focusing, and we get really good at compartmentalizing. All legitimate skills. I bet everyone on this call is pretty good at those things. There's a cost to that, though, is we start to lose appreciation. We start to lose kind of our sense for three corresponding things. So as we get good at who's up and who's down, we lose sight of other kinds of order, like the order of the solar system, or of a tidal pool at the beach, or the order of your favorite song, or the order of, all these other ways of order that aren't hierarchical. Number two, as we get really good at focus, we get tunnel vision, and we lose what you might call awareness of other things around us. And then finally, as we get good at chopping things down into the component parts, we start to lose our touch around things that are relational, that can't be isolated in one individual, but exist between individuals. Things like, so in the corporate setting, things like that can't be understood in a vacuum: customer satisfaction, a competitive landscape, or more basically, just the dynamics of a team. You can't isolate that to any one person. It's what happens between them. So anyway, long story, so that is the pyramid. Now, it is obviously the world of top down. What a lot of people say, oh, I know what I'll do. Let's be bottom up, right? And that does sound better for like a second. But bottom up is no better. It's just that same pyramid run in reverse order. And it forces anyone, let's say we roll out a bottoms up initiative at the university or at a company, it forces people into two choices: either looking at people around them as beneath them, or looking at themselves as beneath someone else. So there is an alternative to this pyramid mindset. And I call it in the book, this constellation mindset. And that is that funny symbol on the dollar bill that most Americans anyway have seen and sort of seen through thousands of times. If you have an American passport, it's bigger. It's right above the eagle's head. It took longer to design. That's the US logo, basically. It took longer to design that logo than it did to win the War of Independence against you guys. But they finally come up with it. And one of the things they figured out early was the motto for this new country: e pluribus unum, right? From many, one. And then they chose the eagle with the olive branches and the arrows and the shield. But this thing above its head was called the crest, and it was supposed to represent the essence of this whole thing. And they chose this weird shape. Originally, on the dollar bill, it's very geometrical, but the original thing that they approved is 13 stars, different sizes, asymmetrically placed, with beams of light radiating behind it. And it symbolized the way we ought to think about how you could be many and one at the same time. They didn't mean from many bricks, one pyramid. That's on the back of the logo, by the way, that pyramid. Now, that is a legitimate way of looking at the world. I think it's a depressing way of looking at the world. If many bricks, one pyramid, you either fit into that pyramid or you are left out. And what's magical about the constellation is you can stand out as a star, an individual, and fit into something bigger and create something more powerful than you ever could on your own as part of a constellation. And you don't lose your individuality as a star, so to speak, by being part of a constellation or more than one constellation. You're enhanced by it. So that's how you can stand out and fit in at the same time. And that's the image, back to Aristotle, that I think we should have at the front of our minds, and not the pyramid.
Okay, and in the book, of course, you talk about how constellation thinking has been incredibly effective at various points in the past, and you talk about some of the people who have pioneered this sort of different integrated approach. Many people, I think, would see the Anglo-American wartime relationship as being founded on the pyramid mindset. And after all, in the United Kingdom, you have Churchill leading very visibly and very audibly from the front with his cigars and his V for victory salute, while in the United States, Roosevelt gradually maneuvers America into the conflict, and in doing so establishes himself as an incredibly powerful four-term president. So on one level, this is often presented, I think, as great men doing great deeds. But interestingly, that's not how you see it. I mean, and this really got me sort of thinking about these events in a new way, because you see the wartime special relationship as an allied constellation.
I do. And I think these images, right when I used to work, as you know, in Grosvenor Square, that beautiful square, I could look out from my window and see FDR on a big plinth all by himself. You can also see in London Churchill on a plinth all by himself. And I understand why, but I think for both those men and the reason you described, one person you won't, and we'll get to him, I think, in a minute, is this wonderful person who was actually the link between those two, Ambassador Gil Wynant. No big statues to him, but my favorite representation of FDR and Churchill is actually just a few blocks away. It's on New Bond Street, and it's that bench where both of these men are sitting on a bench, cast in iron, or bronze, or whatever it is, and but there's space in between them. And I love that. And it's space sort of in today's world, like you can sit down and take a selfie with Churchill and FDR. But I love it as they're sitting in friendship with space in between them. And one of these strange expressions that diplomats are asked to say over and over again, and I must have said it 100 times or more, is often with a sort of forced, stern tone of voice. There is no daylight between the United States and the United Kingdom as it relates to, and fill in whatever topic we're talking about. And I always thought that was so silly and counterproductive and untrue. Right? Of course, there's daylight between the US and the UK on any issue, and it would be weird if there weren't. Right. And so I picture FDR and Churchill on that bench, plenty of daylight between them, space between them, that agreement and disagreement, so much energy lives in disagreement if it can be constructive. And there was lots between those two folks, lots between our countries then and now, that shouldn't be feared, ignored, papered over, swept under the carpet, whatever image you want to use. And back to Constellation, that's what I love about Constellations there is space between the stars. And if there weren't, you couldn't make those interesting patterns.
And in that space between the stars, you've got all sorts of other people working away in special roles to develop the relationship. And you've just mentioned one of them, one of your predecessors as ambassador to the Court of St. James's. And that, of course, was Gil Wynant. And I think we've got a picture of Gil that we're going to put up on the screen. I mean, he's interesting, I think, because he replaced Joseph Kennedy as the US ambassador to the UK in 1941. And he's one of a group of people who you identify as sort of key constellation makers at this moment in history. What makes him a sort of constellation maker? What is it about his approach that is different, perhaps, to other diplomats, to other politicians?
Yeah, he's such a wonderful man. He came from, if you're in FDR's perspective as a Democrat, he came from the wrong party, in quotes. He was a Republican. He was shy. He wasn't a good natural speaker. He stammered and stuttered. Such a contrast, as you said, to Ambassador Kennedy, who was this sort of egomaniacal, boss everybody around type. And I say this growing up in Boston. I mean, the Kennedy name is revered in our country and certainly in the state I grew up in. But the more you read about Joe Kennedy, the less there is. I think, to respect about his way. The rumor was that FDR sent him to London so that he wouldn't run against him for president. And it sounds like a reasonable suspicion, because one of the first things he did when he got to London at his own expense, was to build a perfect replica of the Oval Office in Grosvenor Square. So not very subtle. And Winant couldn't have been more different. He, he committed himself fully to this cause. I mean, Kennedy said it's a lost cause. We should cut a separate peace with Germany. Winant made it his work to make the British cause the American cause. And he knew how hard that would be. And he just devoted every single day to doing it. Big stuff like connecting FDR and his key people back in Washington, but really small things. He'd go, he didn't live in the fancy house, and he'd go and he'd pick up rubble and help people dig out on the way to work every day. So he could see how these small acts of caring tied up to these bigger acts of caring. And he was there with Churchill at Chequers when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And he knew then that, okay, finally, that would mean, he thought, they both felt, that it'd get America to finally join this war. So that's, and I could go on, but he's a wonderful person. I encourage everyone to go explore. Go on to Wikipedia, itself another amazing constellation, how Wikipedia got created, and start your exploration of him there, and you'll lead to some wonderful books.
And your book is full of sort of wonderful examples like this of people who have brought a sort of different approach to big issues. I don't want to misrepresent your book by focusing too much on great men, because your thesis is really about harnessing the power of every individual within the team. But you do have great examples of unsung or largely forgotten individuals who pioneer this more integrative approach. And the one that I found particularly interesting, and someone that I knew nothing about until I read your book, was Mary Parker Follett, who has been described as the mother of modern management. But really, actually, she was a pioneer, I think, in terms of interest in the individual and the role that the individual plays in making things happen. Tell us a little bit more about her.
Wonderful, wonderful person, unknown to me as I started writing this book. And then she sort of started to take it over. One day I'd love to write a book only about her. And there is an amazing biography of her written by a woman named Joan Tonn, Tonn, that I encourage people to read, to really go deep on her life. So in 2003, Harvard Business School asked 200 gurus, as they call them, business gurus. These are folks from business, academia, government, sort of leadership gurus all around the world. Who was your guru? So they published in 2003 the Gurus list. Number one on the list was Peter Drucker, a name I think familiar to many on this call, probably the most quoted management leadership thinker of the 20th century. And it turns out that he had a guru, and he reveals this towards the end of his life. So now, if we stick with it, this is the guru's guru, and it was Mary Parker Follett. And she's amazing. Her dates are 1868 to 1933. So she's born right outside of Boston, right after the Civil War ends. And she ends up writing this. She went to school, got a scholarship to this, what we now call Radcliffe, which is part of Harvard, but at the time it was called the Annex. And she writes this amazing book about power and about the Speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States. And it's a real sensation. And if she had been a man, it would have led to a professorship at a place like Harvard and an academic career, but that was not open to her at the time. So she ends up throwing herself into the forefront of social work and progressive reform in Boston as waves of new Americans, of immigrants, are coming to the country. The first thing she does, she starts a debating club for young boys to kind of keep them out of trouble. And then she goes on to do all sorts of interesting things. And then after 25 years of doing that, she decides to write her second book. And it was really the second book that led to the stuff you were talking about. Now, it's really interesting, I think, for all of us now. She's writing 100 years ago at this point. America is coming out of a global pandemic. Everywhere she looks, she sees social, racial, and economic division. She sees raging debates about the fear of big business, equally raging debates about government overreach in people's lives and into business. Sounds sort of familiar. And she said, look, all those problems can seem incredibly daunting, but there's something each of us can do about it beginning at kind of our Monday morning meeting. And here we are on a Monday morning for those of us in the United States. And she got really practical and tactical. And she says, look, there's only one good outcome of a meeting. There are 4 possible outcomes, but only one of them is worthwhile. And I'll quickly go through them. Bad outcome number 1, you try to win the meeting. And she said, so basically you come in with your fully formed idea of what's the right answer and just try to get everyone else in the meeting to agree to it. She's like, oh, come on, why did you invite other people? Number 2 bad outcome is the opposite of that. You just think, oh, Elizabeth or Alan or Matthew, they're super pushy, just let them have their way. That's what she called acquiescence. That's no good. You're denying that group of a unique perspective, namely your own. The trickiest is number 3. The third bad outcome we're all taught to is a good thing. And it's compromise. And she said, no, compromise really is you just, let's say you come in to a meeting with a fully hatched idea you think is perfect, and then you leave with some subset of that at best. It's really just mini victories and mini acquiescences. So she thought the only reason we should ever gather around a table is to make something together, to co-create something. And if you do that, magic happens in the sense, sort of mundane maybe at first, but real magic, which is you are part of that thing you made as a group. It is forever part of you. But, and this is important about the individual, you aren't diminished. You haven't sort of lost yourself over to this big thing. You are still fully you. And as I reflect on that in today's world that we're all trying to struggle our way through, that if we bring into our next meeting 3 expectations that I think you can boil down Follett's advice into, which is 1, expect to be needed. So in other words, bring your full self, your whole truth. Number 2, expect to need others. That's why you're having a meeting. And then most crucially, number 3, expect to be changed, which is sort of the reciprocal obligation with that first one. So yes, by all means, bring your truth. But if you have succeeded in co-creating something, that next meeting, you should just be a little bit different because that thing you made is part of you now. And that way you avoid bringing your same stale self every time to every meeting. Your sort of stagnant self, you can keep growing by making things with other people. And it all starts with giving power away to that group and then getting it back.
That expect to be changed, I think, is a really a big leap. I mean, it emphasizes the importance of being open to change. And that's something that can require, of course, a lot of bravery. And I wonder if from your own career, sort of reflecting on what you've achieved so far, working with all sorts of different teams, you can give us sort of a couple of examples from your own experience, perhaps one of a team or meeting that didn't work, and one that was successful and where you did achieve this sort of change through integration.
Ooh, that's a fun one. I'll start with the one of the most energy producing things I did. You touched on it a little bit in your introduction, but when I arrived in the UK in 2013, the Pew Charitable Trust had just put out a big research finding around, they interviewed citizens in 40 countries, and in 39 of the 40 countries, young people, which I think were people 18 to 25, had a more favorable opinion of the United States than their parents or grandparents did. And this was no great surprise. I mean, I think President Obama resonated with young people globally. We know that, and this is true, except for one country, and that was the UK, where young people had a lower opinion of the United States. So I thought, well, what should we do about this? One thing I was sure they didn't want was a lecture from an American ambassador. So I ended up, we did these workshops with 100, we basically sixth form colleges. So in America, we'd say high school seniors. Go in, we'd spend an hour, and I would get them on the back of what you guys call an A5 blank card and an embassy pencil. Draw me a picture of something that frustrates or concerns you about the United States. And we'd spend 55 of the 60 minutes talking about their frustrations. So I have these cards up in the attic next door. So 20,000 cards like this, 10,000 of them have the identical picture on them, which is a doodle of a handgun. And so the young people wanted to talk about guns, racism, and police brutality. Those were the top three. And I made a word cloud. We'd update it every time. I went to 200 schools. I have with 20,000 young people talking about frustrations. And then at the end, we would do a fun bit, flip over the card and write a word or draw a picture of something that gives you hope or inspires you about the US. That's important too. There wasn't one big word like guns. There was diversity, opportunity, freedom, food. On the positive side. But I think it's really important to talk about frustrations and confusion. So that's what we did. And by not ignoring the difference, but by embracing it, we generated, I think, in small doses, but it all counts, trust, respect, and understanding between the two countries. So that was on the positive side. I think on the negative side, and I tell the story in the book, and I remember my wife being like, "Oh, do you really have to write this down?" Because she was with me. I'm at this fancy event in the UK where I'm supposed to give what's called a tour d'horizon, a tour of the horizon. And as ambassador, I'm supposed to give an update globally on what the US is seeing. And I never liked these things. I mean, I was good at it in a way because I'd sort of learned to fake it. But I'd be up there talking about South Sudan, about this devastating civil war in Syria, about all the things America is concerned about in foreign policy. And so this one day I had just spent a time up in Scotland. This was around the debate around Scottish independence. And I spent a bunch of time with these high school seniors. Then I come back and I have to give this formal talk. And in that tone of voice that I would adopt for these kinds of things, which is that awful, I don't like it when I hear it in other people. It's worse when I hear it in myself, which is the often wrong, never in doubt tone. And so I'm about to have to go do this thing. And I pass out and projectile vomit and collapse on the floor. Yeah, I mean, it was really embarrassing. I mean, there's no other way of it was, and our host couldn't have been more gracious. It wasn't their fault. It was my fault. And it wasn't anything medical. And I knew that at the moment. And so I wake up from this humiliating experience, weirdly calm, because I was like, I am just not going to do this anymore. I am not going to pretend. And I didn't know I was going to write a book, but the first 3 words of the book are pretending is exhausting. And I think there's just so much pretending encouraged of each of us. And I didn't want to do that kind of pretending, like I knew what was going on in the civil war in Syria, even though I had all the talking points memorized. Like, that is not knowledge that I would love to talk about what I'd learned from young people in Scotland that day about what their hopes and fears were. That seems relevant. And I sort of knew what I was talking about because I had listened. So I determined not to perpetuate that kind of pretending.
So it's that then had a sort of liberating effect for you. It's the power of saying, I don't know, but we can find out and we can work through this together.
Well, that's it. And you just said it, Alan. And I was doing a podcast a couple of weeks ago about the book, and someone was talking about our politics here in the United States, in Washington, D.C. The similar thing could be talked about in London. But if you just said, back to Mary Parker Follett, if you started every meeting, let's say you're in charge of a group and you said, you don't have to be in charge of it to have this relevant, but it's particularly powerful if you do. If you just started the meeting with, I don't know, maybe we might ... What a sort of straightforward, usually honest, because it's rare that you actually know the right answer. Imagine all these meetings happening at every organization about COVID protocols, what to do. I mean, it's built into it ought to be a lot of humility around, like, I don't know, and embrace that uncertainty, which is what constellation thinking does. Pyramid thinking pretends that it knows the right answer and it's just going to work its way back from that right answer. So,
yeah, well, I think that's given us the perfect setup to embrace some uncertainty here and to move into the Q&A. And it won't surprise you to know we've got lots of questions stacking up. So what I'm going to try and do, Matthew, is just to sort of group them a little bit. So let me start with a couple of that have come in. One from Robert in the United States. How does a leader quantify how much power they are giving away? And sort of linked to that from Pradyot, how could US senators share power to be better aligned with the citizens in their state? What could be their constellation?
Okay, those are a good grouping. Thank you both for those questions. You know, okay, lording power over other people, we've all seen how disempowering that can be. Two things that follow if you decide not to lord power over people that are tempting, but I think equally sort of unproductive. One is you hoard it all to yourself. And the third option is you share it. Now, sharing power does sound better than hoarding and lording, except sharing power in that second question often comes with a very, back to images in Aristotle, it's kind of like that kindergarten thing where I have 4 blocks and I need to share 2 with little Tommy or Tina. Implicit in that is it is a scarce resource. There's only so much of it, so share it. But the great leaders, Wynant, Follett, and many others who've done these amazing, like invented the internet, Visa, Wikipedia, all these other things I talk about in the book, what these leaders realized is that power isn't a scarce resource like something you mine, like coal. It is something you make, and it is infinite, and you make it with other people sitting around a table. So in answer to Robert, I think the first question is, how do you quantify? It's you give up all of it because you're giving up, just say, I don't know. And you have to really feel like you don't know. And if you're honest with yourself, you don't know. You might have an inkling or a bit of it, but you don't really know. So you kind of give it all over, not in the spirit of divvying up and sharing, but just like, I don't know. And you give it to the group, so to speak, and then you get it back. And then you give it away again, and then you give it back. So it's 100%. It isn't a fractional, because divvying up is sort of dividing. This is about multiplying.
And so we have a number of questions then that relate, I think, to why is that so difficult. So Bill Isaacs from MIT says things similar to you in his book. Sorry, this comes from Mark Reuter. So what Mark Reuter says is that Bill Isaacs from MIT says things similar to you in his book on dialogue, 1999. So why does the pyramid model always prove so dominant, always seem to be the default setting? Why does the constellation model never seem to catch on? And linked to that, from Jesse in Canada, how often is power actually surrendered? And from Jeff in the United States, please discuss an example of a bad leader, one who is unwilling or unable to delegate.
Ooh, okay, these are fun to try to weave together. I think back to Mark's question around, and I'll go look up Bill Isaac's work. I don't know that work. I'm eager to learn about it. It is so entrenched in all of us, this who's in charge, what's the point, where do I fit in, this hierarchical mindset, even if the organization we don't work in isn't obviously stereotypically top down, it's just inside us. So we really have to see it for what it is and see that we are putting the pyramid mindset, which is why, again, in the arena speech you started off with, it's like, it's so great and empowering, but look at all the things it leaves out, right? You are not going to grow and change as a person if all you're doing is fighting all day. And it's really interesting, back to the senator question, which I didn't directly get at. I mean, Senator Biden, who's now president, ran on healing the soul of a nation. And people made fun of him at the time, but it resonated. But is the act of just fighting all the time lead to healing? It's like shouting for calm. You just have to watch. Is the little thing you're doing like the big thing you want it to be one day? And so the question around surrender, surrender, I think, is such an important, powerful word. It is for me anyway, it brings up sort of military and winning and losing and I give up. And that's not the spirit in which I intended constellation thinking. It's like you give away power to a group to get it back, to give it away again, to get it back again. So it isn't washing your hands of it. And that's what's tricky about words like servant leadership, which also sound kind of good. But I think that the tricky parts about servant leadership is it's sort of like implicit in it was like, hey, you used to be my servant doing what I said. Now I'll try. It's kind of like bottom up. Now I'll be your servant. It's like, no, that's just reinforcing that same pattern of servitude. That's not where energy is created. It is equal stars making new combinations if you bring that constellation mindset to it. A bad leader, I think the book is called The Patriarch, about Joe Kennedy, Ambassador Kennedy, who came before Winant. That is a portrait of, I think, a bad and destructive leader in just about every respect. And it's so fun because Ambassador Winant is such a lovely complement, an alternative to that. But still, Ambassador Kennedy is much more famous now as JFK's dad than Gil Winant is.
Okay, well, we have time, I think, for one sort of final group of questions. And I'm going to try and bring in 3 questions here. First one is from Oliver. He says, I like the analogy of buildings shaping us. And so the pyramidal hierarchy boxing us in. If the aspiration is to remap hierarchical relationships to a constellation, how can that be achieved and in what time frame? I'm worried that once established, the hierarchical model will take millennia to overcome and transform. Linked to that, I think you've got a question that's just come in from Danielle Goodman. How can persistent inequality be addressed via a constellation? And that relates to a question from Caroline. For historically marginalized groups, people of color, women, etc., how can we create environments that allow for this type of leadership when achieving positions of power are hard fought? How can organizations actively promote these different leadership styles so that everyone can explore them? So it's all about really about how you move, I think, from this hierarchical structure and move from this pyramid towards the constellation approach.
Maybe starting with Caroline's to try to, and then go backwards. I should say, practicing what I preach, I don't know. And let me try to contribute. I think this is really what I'm excited to go try to figure out. And I don't really do it in the book. I tee up the main thing, but sort of the detailed, practical, tactical how I am fascinated by and eager to learn how people are trying to do this wherever they might be. And I'm learning a lot from readers about where it's working, where it's not, the obstacles they're bumping into. There's that famous phrase coined by a British guy for the London 2012 Olympics. Diversity is a fact, inclusion's a choice, right? Which I think was, it sort of moved the diversity and inclusion discussion forward with that observation. Diversity is a fact, always has been, look around. It's like, well, what do you do with that? And so that, I think, was an important thing. I would add, I think Mary Follett has 2 more things she would add to that. So if inclusion is getting the right people around the table, that's when the hard work begins. So I think she would add, co-creation is the hard work and interdependence is the prize. So inclusion is not enough. You have to do something with all that wonderful diversity and difference. And that's what we all need to be engaged of, I think, to Caroline's point. And maybe that goes also to the, how do you remap and how can this take some less than 1,000 years? If you try this, probably the question I've gotten most on this tour so far is, yeah, well, what if you work in a pyramid organization or your division is run by a sort of classic pyramid person? How might you do something about it? Which I think relates to that remapping question. And I think if you try it at your next meeting, don't try to get the leader of that group to give up their decision-making power. If they want to be the final say, fine, let them do that for a while. But what we each of us can do, you could do it by yourself. It's better if you could do it with one or two other people on your team at your next Monday morning meeting, is demonstrate for them by saying, I don't know, and actually just make something in a meeting. And it just, I mean, doesn't have to be a product. It could be make a determination, make a product roadmap, make a whiteboard doodle with annotations around whatever it is you're working on. But what I have found, and I think you will discover, is that if you watch 2 or 3 people admit that they don't know something and try to build something together, however simple and basic, that has such an attractive force to the other people who don't know this is happening in the meeting and to the person running the meeting, that if you do that a few Mondays in a row, because that person running the meeting is pretending they know what they're doing, they don't really know. And if you can demonstrate it, even if you quote report up to them, just try that for a while. And I think that can really start to make a real change in a practical and tactical way.
Okay, well, Matthew, huge thanks. We do still have questions coming in, and unfortunately, we're not going to have time for them in this session. But perhaps we can come back to them at a future event.
Yes,
as I hope is obvious, I've
Elizabeth,
really enjoyed reading your book, and I've really enjoyed this conversation today. And both the book and your words now do challenge me to think about the way that I manage and relate to my team and the way that I approach meetings. Am I going into them in a true spirit of integration and interdependence, or am I going in trying to broker a compromise or manage a confrontation? And I think what you advocate is absolutely right, but of course not necessarily easy, especially in patriarchal and hierarchical organizations. What I hope is that it is becoming easier and will become easier for a generation brought up with a focus on social justice and the interdependence of the internet. And I think it will also be made more urgent by the huge issues that the world is facing today. It's interesting that there was a piece in the Guardian newspaper here in the UK just yesterday, which really echoed your words and echoed your approach and called for a new approach to solving these problems and an interdependent approach. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and being so frank, honest, and full and informative with us today. Thank you.
thank you so much, Alan. And please, if Elizabeth or someone could collect the questions we didn't have a chance to go to, I'd love a chance to try to go answer them, like you said, Alan, in some other format. But thank you for your wonderful questions. And thank you, everyone, for being part of this.
Thank you, Matthew and Alan, for sharing this fascinating conversation with all of us today. If you're interested in reading the entirety of Matthew's book, today's webinar attendees can email events@cantab.org with a description of a Constellation-like organization or team you have been part of in your life thus far, or a story of a particularly paralyzing pyramid one. The first 3 emails received will be contacted by Cambridge in America's Alumni Relations and Events team and will be sent a signed copy of The Power of Giving Away Power. If you're interested in purchasing your own copy, a link to an online retailer will be circulated to attendees after the event concludes. On behalf of Cambridge in America, thank you all for joining us and being a vital member of the Cambridge community. We hope you have enjoyed this Alumni Festival session. We look forward to continuing to connect with you, for now in a digital capacity, and hope to see you at future events. Thank you.